On the 24th of April, 1981, a farmer found a young woman's body in a ditch beside a road in Miami County, Ohio. She was somewhere between 18 and 25. She had been dead a short time, hours, not days. She was wearing a distinctive poncho-style jacket made of buckskin, hand-sewn with fringing along the arms. There was no identification, no bag, no vehicle, nothing to say who she was or how she had come to be on that road. The county buried her under a headstone paid for by local people. Because nobody knew her name and because of the jacket, she became known as Buckskin Girl. She stayed that way for 37 years. And then, in April 2018, she became the first person in history to be identified by forensic genetic genealogy. The technique that would, 3 weeks later, produce the arrest in the Golden State Killer case and change American cold case investigation permanently. This is the story of the case that proved it worked. Not the famous one, the first one. Start with 1981, because the year explains everything that followed. The investigation was, by the standards of the time, careful. She had been found quickly, which meant the physical evidence was in good condition. Investigators had her clothing, her physical description, dental information, and eventually a DNA profile once that became possible. They had, in other words, everything you would want, except the one thing that makes all of it useful. They had no name. And this is the structural trap that defines unidentified person cases, so it is worth being precise about it. Almost every forensic tool is a comparison tool. Dental records identify you by matching against records your dentist holds, which requires knowing which dentist. Fingerprints identify you by matching a database of people already printed. DNA identifies you by matching a profile someone has already submitted. Every one of these answers the question, is this the person I think it is? None of them answers, who is this? To convert evidence into an identity, you need a candidate. And to get a candidate in 1981, you needed a missing person report that matched. Hers, if it existed at all, was never connected. It is worth understanding why the missing person route fails as often as it does, because most people assume it is close to automatic. A missing person report is not a national record that investigators can search like a database. Or at least, it was not for most of the period this case sat open. For decades, a report filed with a small-town police department in one state might never be visible to a coroner in another. There was no requirement to enter unidentified remains anywhere central, and no requirement to enter missing people either. The two halves of the same question were being asked in different rooms by people who could not hear each other. That began to change with the creation of a national system for missing and unidentified persons in the mid-2000s. Which for the first time let a coroner in Ohio and a family in Arkansas be looking at the same page. But that arrived 25 years after Marsha King died. And there is a harder problem underneath the administrative one. A missing person report only exists if somebody files it. That requires a person to be missed by someone who believes something is wrong, who then goes to the police, who then take it seriously enough to write it down. Every one of those steps fails routinely, particularly for young adults who are legally entitled to walk away from their own lives and frequently do. A 21-year-old who leaves home is not, in the eyes of any police department, a crime. Families are told to wait. Sometimes they are told correctly that she is an adult and may simply not want to be found. And in the enormous majority of cases that is exactly right. People leave, they come back, or they do not come back and are nonetheless alive and well. The tragedy of an unidentified remains case is that it sits on the wrong side of that entirely reasonable assumption. So the case did what these cases do. Miami County ran her details against missing person files. Facial reconstructions were made and circulated. Her description went out to other agencies. Detectives retired and passed the file on. And every few years, someone new opened it, tried the tools of that era, and got the same answer: nothing. There is a detail about the jacket worth returning to, because it explains something about how these cases were worked before DNA. Investigators leaned on it heavily. A hand-sewn buckskin poncho with fringing is not something you buy in a department store. It is distinctive, probably homemade or bought from a craft seller, and the reasoning was sound. Publicize the unusual object and somebody will remember the person wearing it. That logic drove decades of unidentified person work. Find the distinguishing feature, a tattoo, an item of jewelry, dental work, a surgical scar, and broadcast it as widely as possible. It is why so many of these cases are known by an object rather than a person. Buckskin Girl, Tent Girl, the Lady of the Dunes. Each name is really a description of the one thing investigators had to work with. And it worked occasionally, but think about what it actually required. The right person had to see the appeal, remember a specific garment worn years earlier by someone they had lost touch with, connect it to a body found in a different state, and then act on that hunch strongly enough to contact police. That is a chain of 4 unlikely events. Most of the time it broke at the first link because the appeal never reached anyone who had known her. The jacket that gave Marcia King her interim name was, in the end, the most useful thing about her case for 37 years. And it identified nobody. There was one more thing, and it mattered enormously later. The county did not lose her. Her remains were properly buried and recorded, her evidence was retained, and when DNA profiling matured, her profile was generated and entered into the national system. That is not a given. Plenty of cases from that era have no usable biological evidence left at all, degraded, discarded, or consumed by earlier testing that returned nothing. Buckskin Girl's evidence survived. That single fact is why this story has an ending. It is worth saying something about the place too, because geography matters in these cases more than people expect. Miami County sits in western Ohio, farmland and small towns, crossed by the interstate system that carries traffic between the industrial cities of the Midwest. A body found in a ditch beside a road in that landscape raises an immediate and difficult question. Was she local, or was she passing through? If local, the investigation has a natural starting point. The community, the people who knew her, the ordinary web of a life lived in one place. If she was moved, that web is somewhere else entirely, possibly hundreds of miles away. And the investigators working the case are looking in a county where nobody ever knew her. Marcia King was from Arkansas. That is a very long way from a ditch in western Ohio, and it is the single fact that explains why 37 years of local inquiry produced nothing. The people who could have recognized her description were never going to see it. They were not in Ohio. This is a pattern across unidentified remains cases, and it is a direct consequence of the interstate system. Distance breaks the connection between a body and the community that would recognize it. And before national databases existed, there was no mechanism to bridge that gap. A description circulated in one state simply did not reach another. Genetic genealogy is indifferent to that entirely. It does not care where she was found or where she was from, because the tree it builds is not geographical, it is genealogical, and family trees cross state lines without noticing. Now the science, because the intuition most people have about DNA is the wrong one, and the difference is the entire reason this case broke. Traditional forensic DNA is a lock and key. You have a profile and you compare it against a database of known individuals. It asks a yes or no question of a closed list. If the person you are looking for is not on that list, you learn nothing. And you learn the same nothing every time you ask, for as many decades as you care to keep asking. Genetic genealogy asks something fundamentally different. Not is this person on our list, but who in the public genealogy databases is related to this person, and how closely. The reason it works is inheritance. You receive your DNA in chunks from your parents. They received theirs the same way, and so any two relatives share measurable stretches of identical sequence. The length and number of those shared stretches scale predictably with how close the relationship is. A sibling shares a great deal, a first cousin less. A third or fourth cousin shares a small but reliably detectable amount. And that last part is what makes it powerful. You do not need the person themselves in a database. You need some of their cousins. While everyone has a handful of siblings, everyone has hundreds of third and fourth cousins, most of whom they have never met and would not recognize. So the work goes backwards. A genealogist takes a scatter of distant matches, identifies the common ancestors those matches share, then builds their descendants forward through census returns, marriage certificates, obituaries, and newspaper archives. The branches converge. Eventually, the tree narrows to a small number of living people who could sit at that exact genetic position, right age, right region, right relationships, and one of them is the answer. It is not a laboratory result, it is document research with a genetic starting point, and it is slow, unglamorous, and enormously skilled. Before we get to who finally answered it, it is worth understanding why the technique had not existed until then, because the science it depends on was not built for this at all. Consumer DNA testing began as a curiosity. People spat in tubes to find out what fraction of them was Scandinavian, and to find cousins they had never met. The companies built enormous databases and, crucially, built tools for comparing profiles against each other, because that comparison was the product. Show me who I am related to. Nobody designed that infrastructure to identify the dead. It happened because a handful of people realized that the question a genealogist asks about a living customer and the question an investigator asks about an unidentified body are, mathematically, the same question. That realization is genuinely recent. The first cases were worked in the mid-2010s by people improvising with tools built for family history, and the entire field went from curiosity to standard practice inside about 2 years. Which means something slightly uncomfortable about Marsha King's 37 years. For most of them, no amount of effort or funding would have helped. The method did not exist and could not have existed, because the databases it reads had not been assembled yet. Every investigator who opened that file between 1981 and roughly 2015 was working on a problem that was, at that moment, genuinely unsolvable. The failure was not theirs, it was chronological. In 2017, a non-profit was founded to do exactly this work for unidentified remains, the DNA Doe Project. Volunteers, genealogists, researchers, people who were extremely good at records, working cases that had no one else left working them. It is worth pausing on that model because it is unusual and it explains a great deal about which cases get solved. This is not a laboratory, it is a distributed team of people, many of them working from home in their own time. Exceptionally skilled at a particular kind of research, reading census returns, tracing families through marriage and death records, resolving the ambiguity of a common surname across 3 states and 4 decades. Some came from adoption search work, where the same techniques reunite people with birth families. Others were hobbyist genealogists who discovered their skill had a use nobody had anticipated. A coroner or a police department brings them a case. The remains are sampled, a suitable profile is produced by a laboratory, and that profile is uploaded to the databases that permit this kind of search. Then the volunteers begin building. And that, structurally, is why unidentified remains cases were so neglected for so long. A murder investigation has a victim's family pushing it, a detective assigned to it, and a public that responds to the story. An unidentified person has none of those things. No family in the room, because nobody knows whose family to call. The case generates no pressure, so it receives no resources, so it stays unsolved, so it generates no pressure. That loop ran for decades. What the volunteer model did was break the loop from outside. It did not wait for the funding to arrive. Buckskin Girl was one of the first cases they took. And here the timeline becomes genuinely remarkable. The work did not take years. Once a suitable profile was uploaded and the matches came back, the team narrowed the tree in a matter of days. On the 11th of April 2018, Miami County announced her name. She was Marsha Lenore King, born in 1959 from Arkansas. She was 21 years old when she died. Her family had not known what happened to her for 37 years. 3 weeks later, the same technique produced the Golden State Killer arrest, and the world found out that any of this was possible. Those 3 weeks are worth dwelling on because of what they did to the public understanding of this technique. The Golden State Killer arrest was enormous news. It had everything: a serial offender who had evaded capture for over 40 years, a decades-long manhunt, a dramatic arrest. The coverage was global and sustained, and it established in the public mind what forensic genetic genealogy is for: catching monsters. Buckskin Girl, 3 weeks earlier, got a fraction of that attention. A young woman was given her name back after 37 years by volunteers, and it was a regional story. Which is understandable, and also slightly backwards. Identifying the unidentified is the larger application by a wide margin. There are far more nameless dead than there are uncaught serial offenders. And it is the one that raises fewest objections. Nobody has a civil liberties concern about returning a name to a murdered young woman. But the case that defined the technique publicly was the suspect case. And every argument about genetic genealogy since has been conducted in those terms: police powers, surveillance, consent, the reach of the state. The framing was set by the second case, not the first. If Buckskin Girl had been the story that broke, the debate might have started somewhere quite different, with the tens of thousands of families waiting for a name, rather than with the fear of a police force building a family tree around you. There is something the identification did not do, which matters and is often skipped over when this case is told. Naming her did not solve her murder. Marsha King was identified in April 2018. The question of who killed her and why she was on that road in Ohio when her family were in Arkansas remains open. An identification converts an unidentified remains case into a homicide investigation with a named victim, which is an enormous step because for the first time there is a life to reconstruct. Where had she been? Who had she traveled with? Who saw her last? None of those questions could even be asked for 37 years because they all begin with a name. So the honest framing is that this was not an ending. It was the point at which the investigation could finally start. And the same is true of most of these cases. Genetic genealogy is extraordinarily good at answering "who is this?" and has nothing to say about "who did this?" unless the offender also left DNA. It is also worth being precise about what a name does, practically, because it is easy to treat identification as purely symbolic. A named victim has a life that can be reconstructed. Every question about her final months is a lead, and none of them can be asked of an unidentified body. A name also unlocks records: employment, medical, school, phone. It gives you people to interview: family, friends, anyone who knew her. Every one of those is a thread that simply does not exist, while the victim is a Jane Doe. And it changes the legal position. An unidentified body is a case file. A named victim is a person with a family who has standing, who can push, who can be told things, and who can insist the case stays open. The pressure that keeps investigations alive comes almost entirely from families, which is exactly why nameless cases go quiet. So identification is not the end of the work, it is the point at which the work becomes possible. Now, what this case actually teaches, because it is not the same lesson as a suspect identification. There is something worth saying about the interim name too, because Buckskin Girl did a strange double duty for 37 years. On one hand, it was necessary. A case needs a handle. Investigators, reporters, and the public cannot discuss a file number. The name made her memorable, and memorability was the entire strategy. The more people who knew the case, the better the odds somebody made a connection. On the other hand, a name derived from a garment quietly reduces a person to the object they were found in. For nearly 4 decades, she was known to the world by a jacket. Every article, every appeal, every online discussion referred to her by a description of her clothing, because that was all anyone had. The volunteers and investigators who work these cases are conscious of this, which is why the language around them has shifted. The interim names persist because they are practical, but the aim is always stated the same way: to give the name back. Not to solve, not to close, to return something that was taken. And when the announcement came in April 2018, that is exactly what happened. The county that had buried her, paid for her headstone, and carried her as Buckskin Girl for 37 years, could finally say who she was. Marsha Lenore King, born 1959 from Arkansas, 21 years old. The headstone was changed. That is a small physical act, and it is the entire point of the work. A piece of granite in an Ohio cemetery that had described a jacket now describes a person. First and most importantly, the information needed to identify Marsha King existed continuously from the day she died. It was in her own cells and in the cells of relatives who had no idea they were relevant. 37 years of investigators did not fail through incompetence or lack of care. They failed because the method for reading that information had not been invented. What was missing was never evidence. It was a way to read it. That should change how you think about the phrase cold case. We imagine a mystery with a missing piece, a witness who never came forward, a clue somebody overlooked. Sometimes that is true, but an enormous number of these files are cases where the answer was already present, in a form nobody could yet decode. Second, the scale of what this reopens is difficult to take in. At any given time, there are tens of thousands of unidentified person cases open in the United States. People recovered, examined, catalogued, and stored, with everything known about them except who they were. Thousands more are added every year. It is worth pausing on that figure because the number alone does not convey what it means. Tens of thousands of open cases means tens of thousands of families who do not know. And the character of that not knowing is specific and worth understanding because it is not the same as grief. Grief has a shape. Something happened, it is known, and the process of absorbing it, however long and however hard, has a direction. What these families have instead is ambiguous loss, a person who is simultaneously absent and unaccounted for. There is no funeral because there is no confirmed death. There is no closure because nothing has closed. And there is a small, corrosive possibility that never quite extinguishes, that she is alive somewhere and has chosen not to be in contact. Researchers who study this describe it as one of the most difficult forms of loss precisely because it cannot resolve. The mind cannot complete a process it has no ending for. 37 years is most of an adult lifetime. People who loved Marsha King spent theirs in that state, and some of them will not have lived to hear her name read out in 2018. That is what is sitting in those tens of thousands of files, not an administrative backlog, a very large number of people in a condition that only an answer can end. Third, this case was solved by volunteers, not by a well-funded task force. The DNA Doe project ran on donations and unpaid expertise, and it has since gone on to return dozens of names to families. The bottleneck in this work is not the science. The science is now routine. It is hours. People building trees, cross-referencing census returns, chasing a marriage record through 3 states to eliminate a single branch. That is slow, invisible, largely unpaid labor, and it is currently the only thing standing between a great many families and an answer. There is one more thing this case established that had nothing to do with the science, and it may prove to be the more important legacy. It proved the work could be done outside the system. Before Buckskin Girl, the assumption was that identifying the unidentified was a job for medical examiners, state laboratories, and funded task forces. Institutions, in other words, with budgets and mandates, and those institutions had been trying, within their means, for decades. What the DNA Doe project demonstrated is that the binding constraint was never institutional capacity. It was a particular skill, genealogical research, that existed in enormous quantity outside those institutions, sitting in the hands of hobbyists who had spent years learning to read census returns for fun. That is a genuinely unusual shape for a breakthrough. It is not a new machine or a new discovery. It is a realization that the expertise required to solve thousands of open cases was already distributed across the general public, unpaid and unaware of its own relevance. And it has held up. Since 2018, volunteer teams have returned names in case after case, many of them older than this one. The model spread because it worked, not because anyone funded it into existence. Which raises an obvious and slightly damning question. How many other categories of unsolved problem are sitting in the same position, waiting not for a discovery, but for somebody to notice that the necessary skill already exists somewhere nobody thought to look? Fourth, the argument this technique created, which is real and does not have a clean resolution. The reach that identified Marsha King came from ordinary people uploading their DNA to public databases to find their ancestors. None of them were asked whether they wanted to become a search index. And because relatedness runs outward, a single person's decision to test exposes hundreds of relatives who made no decision at all. You cannot consent on behalf of your third cousins, but genetically you do. After the Golden State Killer case made this public, the main open database changed its terms so that law enforcement matching became something users opted into rather than out of. And the available pool contracted sharply. The large consumer companies do not permit access without legal process and never have. It is worth noticing that identifying a victim and identifying a suspect are not quite the same act, even though they use the same tool. Most people's instinct is that returning a name to a dead young woman is straightforwardly good, while building a family tree around a living person who has not been charged with anything is not. But the databases cannot tell the difference. The same reach does both, and there is no version of the tool that does one and not the other. And there is a last thought worth sitting with about what this case says regarding the ones still open. The DNA Doe project took Buckskin Girl early, one of its first cases, and the tree came together in days once the right profile was uploaded. That speed is not typical, and it is worth being honest about why it happened here. Her genetic profile was good. Enough relatives had tested, the records existed, every condition lined up. Most cases are not like that. Many take months of tree building. Some are attempted and fail, the DNA too degraded, the family branches too sparsely tested, the paper trail broken by migration or by records that were never kept. Those failures do not make the news, and they are far more numerous than the successes. So the honest picture is not that a technique has arrived which solves these cases. It is that a technique has arrived which solves some of them unevenly, depending on conditions largely outside anyone's control, and that we now have to work through an enormous backlog one file at a time, knowing that a meaningful proportion will still resist. That is less satisfying than the version where science triumphs. It is also the version that tells you why the volunteer hours matter so much, and why every year of delay costs cases that were solvable when the evidence was fresher. Marcia King got her name because the conditions happened to be right and because somebody chose her file. Both of those things were, to a degree that ought to trouble us, a matter of luck. Finally, the thing that is easiest to lose in a story about databases and trees. Marcia King was 21. She was somebody's daughter, and her family spent 37 years not knowing, which is its own specific kind of grief because it never resolves into mourning. There is no funeral for someone who has simply stopped being in contact. There is only the phone that does not ring and the possibility, never quite extinguished, that she is alive somewhere and will one day get in touch. The people of Miami County buried her and paid for her headstone, having no idea who she was. That headstone said Buckskin Girl for 37 years, and it now carries her name. That is what this work is for. Not the technique, not the record setting, not the fact that it happened first. The name on the stone, the difference between a person and an unidentified body, between somebody who lived and something that was found. Sources for this account include the Miami County Sheriff's Office announcement of the identification in April 2018, the DNA Doe Project's published account of its work on the case, contemporaneous reporting of the 1981 discovery and the 2018 identification, and public records relating to the case. Where details of the investigation remain unreleased, this account says so rather than filling the gap. The homicide itself remains unsolved. On the 10th of November 1985, a hunter moving through the woods at the edge of Brook State Park in Allenstown, New Hampshire, found a 55-gallon metal drum lying on its side near the ruins of a burned-out country store. Inside it were the remains of two people. For the next 34 years, almost no one on Earth would know who they were. This is the story of the Brook murders. 4 victims, 2 barrels found 15 years apart in the same patch of forest. A killer who changed his name so many times that police arrested him, convicted him, and buried him without ever learning who he actually was. And a new science, a way of reading family trees out of DNA, that gave 3 of the victims their names back in 2019, helped catch the Golden State Killer along the way. And then, in September 2025, 40 years after a hunter opened that drum, finally reached the 4th. She was the smallest of them, and the hardest, because the ordinary way you identify a child is to find the person looking for her, and no one was. We will get to her. She is the reason this story took 4 decades to finish. Start with the barrel, because the barrel itself is evidence. A 55-gallon steel drum is not a hiding place you improvise. It is heavy, empty, and unmanageable full. Getting one into woodland means a vehicle, a route, and either help or considerable determination. Whoever left it there had made a decision, acquired a container, transported it, and chosen a spot. And the spot itself was chosen well. The ground around the old store was disturbed, overgrown, unremarkable. It was the kind of place that looks like nothing for as long as nobody has a reason to look. The remains inside belonged to an adult woman, somewhere between her early 20s and early 30s, and a girl of roughly school age. The medical examiner ruled both deaths homicides. They had been in the woods a long time, likely years, and time had taken almost everything an investigator normally leans on. Understand what that means in practice. In 1985, identifying an unknown body ran through a short list of doors, and this case found every one of them locked. Fingerprints require fingertips. Dental comparison requires knowing which dentist to write to. Dental records are a matching tool, not a search engine, so they only help once you already have a name to test. Facial reconstruction requires someone to see the sketch and recognize it. And every one of those routes ultimately terminates in the same place: a missing person report. Somebody, somewhere, has to have noticed that a person stopped existing. Nobody had. The police did what police do. They checked the woman and the child against missing person files in New Hampshire, then across New England, then nationally. Nothing came back. Facial reconstructions were made and circulated, nothing. A woman and a child had been left in a state forest, and no report anywhere in the country matched them. Sit with how strange that is. A child of school age has a life that generates records almost automatically. A school notices an empty desk. A doctor's office notices a missed appointment. Neighbors notice. For a woman and a girl to vanish and generate no report at all, the ordinary machinery of being noticed has to fail completely. And that usually means they had already been moved a long way from anyone who would do the noticing. In 1986, the people of Allenstown buried them in a donated grave under a headstone for the unnamed dead. That detail is worth pausing on, because it is the only kindness available in a case like this. A town of a few thousand people with no connection to these two beyond the fact that they had been left in its woods paid for a place to put them. The case went cold, the way cases without names almost always do. Not because anyone stopped caring, but because there was nothing left to work. A cold case is not usually a case with a missed clue. It is a case where every available thread has been pulled to its end. It stayed cold for 15 years, and then an investigator went back to the woods. On the 9th of May 2000, a New Hampshire State Police detective, re-examining the original scene, located another 55-gallon drum, roughly 100 yards from where the first had been found. Inside it were the remains of 2 more children, 2 little girls, 1 a toddler, 1 barely older. Take a moment on that 100 yards. For 15 years, investigators, reporters, hunters, and volunteers had walked that ground. The second barrel had been there the entire time, through the original search, through the burial, through every anniversary appeal. It had sat within shouting distance of the first, and the reason it stayed hidden is simply that woodland closes over things, and searches are bounded by assumptions. The first barrel had been found, so the first barrel was the scene. Nobody had drawn the circle wide enough. 4 victims now, a woman and 3 small girls. And here the forensic work produced the first real structure in the case. Mitochondrial DNA is genetic material passed down effectively unchanged through the maternal line. A mother gives it to all her children, and her daughters pass it on again. It cannot tell you who someone is. It has no name attached, but it can tell you with confidence whether 2 people share a mother, a grandmother, or a great-grandmother somewhere back along that line. The results drew a shape. The woman was maternally related to the oldest girl and to the youngest girl, consistent with a mother and 2 of her daughters. But the middle child, the toddler from the second barrel, was not maternally related to any of them. She had been left in the ground alongside a family that was not hers. Hold on to that detail. It is strange now. It becomes the hinge of the entire case. Because it tells you something about the man who put them there. He was not disposing of one household in one night. He had access to a child from somewhere else, and he treated her the same way. Whatever this was, it had happened more than once, in more than one place, and the 4 people in those barrels were connected not by blood, but by proximity to the same person. For years, that was where it stood. Investigators tried everything the era offered. In the 2010s, isotope analysis of hair and teeth, chemistry that records the water you drink and the food you eat, and therefore roughly where you have lived, suggested the victims had spent real time in the northeastern United States, not simply been transported there after death. So the case had a shape without a single fact you could put on a headstone. A family, plus 1 child who did not belong to it, killed somewhere around the late 1970s or early 1980s, living in the Northeast for some period before they died. No names, no suspect, no obvious route to either. The break, when it came, did not come from New Hampshire at all. It came from California, from a case that seemed to have nothing whatever to do with barrels in a forest 3,000 miles away. In 1986, at an RV park in Scotts Valley, California, a man calling himself Gordon Jensen abandoned a little girl he said was his daughter. He left her with neighbors and disappeared. The girl came to be known as Lisa, and she grew up without knowing who she actually was, not adopted out of a known history, but out of nothing at all. The man was later arrested under a different name, Curtis Kimball, served time connected to abandoning her, was released on parole, and vanished again. Look at the mechanics of that, because they explain how he survived so long. In the 1980s, an identity was a set of documents and a story, and the systems that held them did not talk to each other. A name checked out in one state was not a name checked in another. A parole officer in one county had no window into a different county's files. A man willing to abandon everything, job, address, vehicle, the people who knew his face, could step out of one identity and into another with very little friction, provided he never stayed long enough for anyone to become curious. He resurfaced years later in the Bay Area as Larry Vanner. In 2002, the remains of his partner, a chemist named Yoon-Soon Jun, were found at the home they shared in Richmond, California. In 2003, he was convicted of her murder and sentenced to 15 years to life. And here the systems finally did talk. When investigators ran his fingerprints, Larry Vanner came back as Curtis Kimball, which came back as Gordon Jensen. 3 names, 1 man. Fingerprints do what documents cannot. They attach to the body rather than the paperwork. But they only proved that his names were false. They could not produce the true one. A fingerprint is only as useful as the records it can be matched against, and every record they matched was another alias. Then a DNA test proved something stranger still. Lisa, the girl he had abandoned and claimed as his daughter, was not related to him at all. He refused to say who she was. In December 2010, he died in a California prison, convicted under a name that was not his, and took the answer with him. As far as anyone knew, that was the end of it. A man had died in custody for one murder, having supplied the state with a false name and a child who did not belong to him, and there was no obvious way to compel a dead man to explain either. It was not the end. And this is where the story turns, not on a confession, or a witness, or a deathbed letter, but on arithmetic. A retired patent attorney named Barbara Ray Venter had taken up genetic genealogy. The discipline of building family trees outward from a DNA profile, using the same public databases hobbyists use to find their ancestors. It is worth understanding how this actually works, because the intuition most people have about DNA evidence is the wrong one, and the difference is the whole reason this case broke. Traditional forensic DNA is a lock and key. You take a sample from a scene, generate a profile, and compare it against a database of known offenders. If your man is in that database, you get a match. If he is not, you get nothing. And you get nothing no matter how many times you run it. It is a yes or no question asked of a closed list. Genetic genealogy asks a different question entirely. It does not ask, is this person in the database? It asks who in the database is related to this person, and how closely. Because we inherit our DNA in chunks from our parents, and they from theirs, any two relatives share measurable stretches of identical sequence, and the length and number of those shared stretches scale predictably with how close the relationship is. A sibling shares a great deal, a first cousin shares less, a third cousin shares a small but detectable amount. That last part is the key. You do not need your suspect or your victim in the database. You need some of their cousins. And the further out the technique reaches, the more people qualify, because everyone has a handful of siblings, but hundreds of third and fourth cousins, most of whom they have never met. So the genealogist starts with a set of distant matches and works backwards. Find the common ancestors those matches share. Build their descendants forward through census records, marriage certificates, obituaries, and newspaper archives. Watch the branches converge. Eventually, the tree narrows to a small number of people who could sit at that exact position. The right age, the right place, the right relationships, and one of them is your answer. It is not a laboratory result. It is document research with a genetic starting point, and it takes months or years of unglamorous work. Working with an investigator from the San Bernardino County Sheriff's Department, Ray Venter took on Lisa's case, the girl with no origin. Through years of tree building, they found her. Lisa was Dawn Bowden from Manchester, New Hampshire. Her mother, Denise Bowden, had vanished from Manchester in 1981, shortly after Thanksgiving, along with her infant daughter and her boyfriend, a man the family knew as Bob Evans. Denise Bowden has never been found. There is a question buried in that identification which the case has never answered, and it is the one that stays with people longest. Dawn Bowden lived. Her mother left Manchester with Rasmussen and was never seen again. The infant she carried with her was abandoned at an RV park in California 5 years later, left with neighbors, alive, and eventually raised by other people. Every other child we know of who was in his company ended up in a barrel in New Hampshire. This one he put down and walked away from. Nobody can say why. It would be easy to reach for an explanation, that some flicker of restraint applied to her and not the others, or that abandoning a child was simply more convenient than the alternative that day. Both are guesses, and this case has been damaged before by people preferring a satisfying theory to a documented fact. What can be said is narrower and stranger. Because he abandoned her instead of killing her, she was alive to be identified. Because she was alive to be identified, genetic genealogy had a living subject to work on, rather than remains. Because that work succeeded, it produced the name Denise Bowden. And Denise Bowden produced Manchester, New Hampshire, 10 miles from Allenstown. The entire case unlocks through the one child he let go. Now follow what New Hampshire investigators did with that, because it is the moment the whole thing collapses inward. Bob Evans had lived in Manchester in the early 1980s, working as an electrician. Manchester is about 10 miles from Allenstown. From the California prison system, authorities had the DNA of the man who had died as Larry Vanner. They compared it to the Brook victims. In January 2017, the New Hampshire authorities announced the result. The man from California was the biological father of the middle child. The girl in the barrel, who belonged to no one, belonged to him. Consider what that meant for the investigation. The Brook killer had been in custody since 2002. He had been convicted of murder in 2003. He had been dead since 2010. For the entire period in which New Hampshire was searching for an unknown offender, the offender was sitting in a California cell under someone else's name, and then lying in a grave under someone else's name. The question was no longer where is he, it was who was he? Genetic genealogy answered that too. In August 2017, the New Hampshire Attorney General's office announced that Gordon Jensen, Curtis Kimball, Larry Vanner and Bob Evans were all one man. Terry Peder Rasmussen, born in Denver, Colorado in 1943, a Navy veteran and trained electrician who had walked out of his own life in the mid-1970s and spent the rest of it wearing other people's. Investigators took to calling him the chameleon. And once his real name existed, his trail could be read backwards. And the pattern in it is the most disturbing thing in this case. Everywhere he touched down, a woman or a child connected to him ended up dead or missing. Not once. Repeatedly across states, across decades, under different names, with different people, and each time the disappearance was absorbed into the ordinary noise of people losing touch. That is the part worth sitting with. He did not evade a manhunt. There was never a manhunt because there was never a report. His method was not to escape the search, it was to select people whose absence would not start one. But the victims in the barrels still had no names. And what happened next is why this case matters far beyond itself. Ray Venter's work identifying Lisa had proven that genetic genealogy could resolve cases nothing else could touch. In April 2018, the same technique, with Ray Venter assisting investigators, identified Joseph James DeAngelo as the suspect in the Golden State Killer case, the arrest that announced this science to the world. Bear Brook was not a footnote to that revolution, it was the proving ground. The method was tested on a girl nobody could name before it was ever pointed at a man everybody wanted to catch. And that order of events matters more than it might seem, because it shaped the argument that came afterwards. When the public learned how DeAngelo had been found, the reaction split immediately. On one side, a serial murderer had been identified after more than 40 years, using nothing but public data and patience. On the other, none of the people whose DNA made that possible had ever been asked. They had uploaded their profiles to find a grandparent's birthplace and had unknowingly become a search index for law enforcement. And not only for themselves. Because relatedness runs outward, a single person's decision to test exposes hundreds of relatives who made no decision at all. You cannot consent on behalf of your third cousins, but genetically you do. The databases responded and the ground shifted fast. GEDmatch, the open platform at the center of the DeAngelo identification, changed its terms in 2019 so that law enforcement matching became something users had to opt into rather than something they had to opt out of. The available pool collapsed overnight. Family tree DNA, which had permitted law enforcement use, faced a backlash from its own customers. The large consumer companies, the ones most people have actually heard of, do not hand over access without legal process, and never have. So the technique that solved Bear Brook now operates on a far smaller pool than the one that broke it. Which puts a genuine dilemma at the center of this. The same reach that names a murdered 4-year-old is the reach that lets a police force build a family tree around someone who has done nothing at all. Both of those are the same capability. There is no version of the tool that does the first and not the second. It is worth knowing that the debate exists and worth resisting the easy answer in either direction, because the case you are watching is the one where it worked. The last piece came from a volunteer. Rebecca Heath, a research librarian from Connecticut, spent her spare time in missing person forums and had been quietly working the Bear Brook case for years. That is worth stating plainly. Not an investigator, not a forensic scientist. A librarian whose professional skill is knowing how to search and how to keep looking after the obvious search has failed. She found a thread that fit. A woman named Marlice Honeychurch had last been seen at Thanksgiving in 1978 at her mother's home in La Puente, California, with her 2 young daughters. There had been an argument. She had left that night with her boyfriend. The boyfriend was Terry Rasmussen. And here is the answer to the question that had sat over the case since 1985. Why no one ever filed a report. The family had believed for 40 years that Marlice had cut ties after a falling out and built a life somewhere else. That is not neglect. It is the most ordinary assumption in the world, and in almost every case it is correct. People leave after arguments. People stop calling. The overwhelming majority of them are alive. So there was no report, because from the outside, nothing had happened that needed one. That single misapprehension held for 4 decades, and it was the thing that kept 4 people nameless. DNA closed it. In June 2019, 34 years after the hunter found the first drum, the New Hampshire authorities gave 3 of the 4 victims their names back. The woman was Marlies Elizabeth Honeychurch. The oldest girl was her daughter, Marie Elizabeth Vaughan. The youngest was her daughter, Sarah Lynn McWaters, who was around a year old. A mother and her daughters, last seen alive in California in 1978, found in New Hampshire in 1985 and 2000, named in 2019. 3 of the 4, not the middle child. And here is precisely why she was the hard one, because it is not a matter of effort, but of structure. Genetic genealogy finds you by finding your relatives. It works because somewhere out there is a family with your DNA in it, and with people in it curious enough about their ancestry to have tested. Marlies, Marie and Sarah had that. They had a family who had wandered for 40 years, whose genetic material was sitting in those databases waiting to be matched against the right question. The middle child's closest known relative was the man who killed her. Her mother had never been reported missing by anybody. There was no family wondering because as far as anyone could tell, no one knew she was gone. There was no thread to pull because there was no one holding the other end of it. She was somewhere between 2 and 4 years old. She was Terry Rasmussen's biological daughter. For 6 more years after the others were named, she remained a Jane Doe, the child the chameleon fathered, carried across the country and erased so completely that the very method which unmasked him could not say who she was. That is a particular kind of cruelty, and it is worth naming. He had not only killed her, he had removed her from the record of people who exist. And for 6 years, the science that solved everything else in this case ran into that void and stopped. Then, in early 2024, the New Hampshire State Police Cold Case Unit went back to her with the DNA Doe Project, a non-profit that works unidentified remains cases with volunteer genealogists. This time they worked the other side of the tree. Every previous attempt had, reasonably, tried to find her mother's family, the people who should have been looking. That approach had failed for 6 years. So instead they took the faint, distant matches on any branch that would give, not close cousins, but remote ones, the kind that share a fragment of sequence and a common ancestor several generations back. Then they built forward. Every branch, every descendant, every marriage, every move, until the possibilities narrowed to a child who could occupy that exact position in the tree. It took 1.5 years of documents and testing. On the 5th of September 2025, New Hampshire announced her name. She was Rhea Rasmussen, born in 1976 in Orange County, California. Her mother was a woman named Pepper Reed, born in 1952, originally from Texas, and Pepper Reed has not been seen by anyone since the late 1970s. So all 4 of them have their names now: Marlies, Marie, Sarah, Rhea. 4 decades, 2 barrels, and a science that did not exist when any of them died. And in the same breath that closed the last question, the case opened another one. Because somewhere in the record is a woman from Texas who disappeared around the same time her daughter did, and nobody ever reported her missing either. The same silence that hid Rhea for 40 years is still sitting over her mother. Consider what actually happened here, because the shape of it says something uncomfortable about how safe any of us are from being forgotten. A man committed murders in 1 decade. He was caught for a different murder in another decade, under a different name. He died before anyone connected the two. Every ordinary tool of the 20th century, fingerprints, missing person files, dental records, facial reconstruction, press appeals, decades of competent police work, failed for over 30 years. And it failed for a reason more specific than bad luck. Almost every one of those tools depends on somebody having raised an alarm. The system is built on the assumption that when a person disappears, the absence gets noticed and reported, and investigation flows from there. Rasmussen's entire method was to defeat that first step. Choose people who are already isolated. Move them far from anyone who would ask. Rely on the fact that a family who has fallen out will assume silence means estrangement rather than death. What broke it was not a confession or a witness. It was the mathematics of kinship. The fact that no one, however many names he wears, can change who he is related to. Relatedness is not a document. It cannot be abandoned in an RV park or left behind in another state. Rasmussen spent his life proving that a man can erase himself. Genetic genealogy proved that his DNA never signed on to the arrangement. And Brook is not an isolated puzzle that happened to get solved. It is a sample of a much larger backlog. At any given time in the United States, there are tens of thousands of open, unidentified remains cases sitting in medical examiners' offices and county records. People recovered, examined, catalogued and stored, with everything known about them except who they were. Several thousand more are added every year. Most will never make the news. Each one is somebody's version of the woman in the first barrel, a file with measurements and estimates and no name at the top. For decades, those cases were effectively terminal. If the missing person report never existed or never matched, there was nothing further to do. And a case with no name generates no pressure, because pressure comes from families, and a nameless victim has no family in the room. What Brook demonstrated is that the terminal category was never as fixed as it looked. The information needed to name those 4 people had existed continuously since the day they died. It was sitting in their own cells and in the cells of relatives who had no idea they were relevant. What was missing was not evidence. It was a method for reading it. That is why the volunteers matter so much in this story and why the librarian belongs in it alongside the scientists. The bottleneck now is not the science, it is ours, genealogists building trees, cross-referencing census returns, chasing a marriage record through 3 states to eliminate one branch. It is slow, unpaid, and almost entirely invisible, and it is currently the thing standing between a great many nameless people and their names. 2 people are still owed that. Denise Baudin, who walked out of Manchester with Rasmussen after Thanksgiving 1981 and was never seen again. And Pepper Reed, Ria's mother, missing since the late 1970s, never reported by anyone. The genealogists who spent a year and a half naming a 4-year-old are, as far as anyone can tell, not planning to stop. Marlise, Marie and Sarah have their names on the record now. Their family knows what happened, which is a hard gift, but a gift because the alternative was another 40 years of assuming she simply never called again. Rhea has her name too, 4 decades after a man put her in a barrel expecting she would never have one. That is the whole point of this work. It is not vengeance. He was already dead when they identified him, and no court will ever hear the Brook case. The point is the name on the headstone, the difference between a person and an unidentified body, between someone who lived and something that was found. If you know the Brook case, or the work of the volunteers and genealogists who broke it open, put it in the comments. This case was cracked in large part by people doing unpaid research in their own time, and that deserves saying out loud. Sources for this account include the New Hampshire Attorney General's Office and New Hampshire State Police announcements of 2017, 2019, and September 2025, the DNA Doe Project's work on the final identification, California court records in the Yoon Soon Jun case, and reporting by New Hampshire Public Radio's Brook investigation. Where accounts differ on detail, the official record is what is followed here. The records matter more than the theories.